There aren't any burning questions right now. I'd like to introduce our guest speaker. And I'd like to use her own words, and I think you'll see why in a minute. Norah Keating first noticed aging in older people when she was in her early 20s. Her father had just decided to retire, and her grandmother was near the end of her life. She learned from observing and talking with them that the older people became, the more interesting they were. Imagine having that smarts and insights as a 20-year-old. These family experiences began a lifelong career in studying aging and a passion for making the world a better place for older people and their families. In the past few years, she has worked mainly on international aspects of aging and has been privileged to interact with older people in many parts of the world. She currently works at universities in Canada, Europe, and Africa, and with large organizations such as the World Health Organization and the International Association of Gerontology and Geriatrics. You'll be pleased to know that she is now old enough to be very interesting. And she's got a very provocative title for her talk. If aging in place is the answer, what's the question? Dr. Norah Keating.
Thanks so much, Paula. I must say I'm just delighted to be here. Of all the places in the world that I travel, it's northern places that I like the best. So thank you for inviting me in. So ladies and gentlemen, Minister Frost, let me talk to you about this provocative title of mine. But first, I'd like to acknowledge the minister's comments this morning about being raised by her grandmother. I wasn't raised by my grandmother, but she did and continues to have a profound impact on my life. I was the granddaughter, the lucky granddaughter, I guess, to whom she talked about her life as she looked back. And now I realize was really wrapping up a long life. She lived to be almost 90. That wasn't always an easy life, but one in which she had challenges and she overcame them, and as I look back, was a wonderful model to me of a strong woman who made her own way at times when women, were expected to be strong, but only in a very small part of life. I have gone on to develop around the world what I call the Old Girls Network, and I'd welcome any of you old girls in, and a few men, but on the fringes, gentlemen. Okay, having said something provocative to start, let me talk about this question about if aging in place is the answer. What is it that we're resolving here? And I suppose for me, the question is, so what do we older people need that aging in place might solve? And just as an aside, I would like to say that we older people are a 20th century triumph. Don't ever let anybody talk about silver tsunamis or crashing waves on the shore of an apocalyptic demography. We are good stuff, ladies and gentlemen. We've been celebrated all along through our lives. As baby boomers, we were welcomed after the Second War. We were supported. We were the people who got the jobs and went to school and did all these wonderful things. How is it now that in some places we're seen as a problem? So we're not going to put up with that, and I'm at the point in my life where I can be radical enough not to put up with it. And so, older people's needs. Well, I suppose at their most basic we need food and clothing and shelter. But in my own work and in thinking about my own aging, I'd also say that the big ones are health and wealth and someone to love. Health that's good enough. Health that's good enough to allow me to do the things that are important to me. Wealth that's enough to ensure I have those basics of food, clothing, and shelter, and perhaps a bit more to visit those people I care about who are in various parts of the world and to meet some new ones. And someone to love, a partner, a child, an old friend. Those are pretty important too. We each have a different version of which of these are important to us. Two examples come to mind from my interactions with older people here in Canada. One was a bachelor farmer in southern Alberta, and he lived all his life pretty much alone out on his farm and was having trouble managing. And so there were attempts being made to find him the right assisted living place. And he had seen several, all of which he'd rejected. And finally, I guess he said to the person helping him out, he said, "You know, all I want is a warm bed and a full belly." And another one, which I think is probably my favorite example of what older people need, was a woman from a northern community in Saskatchewan who, when asked about what would make her community a good place to grow old, said, "Money, malls, and men." Wait for it. And then there was a pause. In that order. So, how did the Government of Yukon come to the idea of aging in place? Well, the minister has talked a little bit about that question, but what I know is that she's interested in what you think, and she's here today to listen, and that I've been invited along to help her and you out. My own experience is that in Canada, and perhaps especially here in the North, there's a strong sense of we're all in this together, and that everyone counts as important. My guess is that it helps that the population of Yukon is small, and that people know one another, and that their lives are interconnected. As far as I can tell, there is nowhere for this government to hide. And it helps that there aren't that many people over age 65 in all of Yukon. My guess, too, is that you have a government that takes very seriously the United Nations Millennium Development Goal, which is to leave no one behind. There's a tremendous opportunity here. Think about aging in Yukon and how people are known and you've got a government that's supportive. And then take yourself to China and think about aging in place there and what you would do if you were one of the ministers there. There are now 123 million people in China who are over age 65. In 30 years, there will be 330 million older people. Will it ever be possible there to leave no one behind and to ensure that all of the places they live are good places to grow old? So, Minister Frost, when you got Yukon organized, they could use you in China. So let's begin this day reflecting on this idea that, frankly, someone, and I hate to think it might have been an academic like me, made up a few years ago, this aging in place idea. And that has become something that researchers and policymakers have embraced. As far as I know, not many older people sit around talking to each other about aging in place. We're just living our lives, and making the best that we can of them. Now, one of the nice things about me being from away, as they say in the Maritimes, is that I can say things that are provocative, and then the next day I get on a plane and I get out of town. So, some things that I'd like to say that you may wish to consider. And these things are mostly about places. There are places where you might well like to grow old. There are also places where no one wants to grow old. There are places that used to be good places to grow old, but aren't anymore. And there are places that are good for now, but might not be good for later. And we'll talk a little bit about some of those. So, if aging in place is a good idea, and I think it's still a question mark for me, it probably depends on all of these things. Now, if you have any inclination that the experts agree on what is meant by aging in place, I'm going to set that aside for you early on in this talk. And I'm going to talk to you about 2 or 3 different definitions of aging in place which don't line up particularly well. So you're in new territory here, ladies and gentlemen, and Minister Frost. We'll talk later. Here's an example from researchers in New Zealand and in Canada that was published about 3 years ago. And they're talking about aging in place in a way that's very common, certainly in Canada. They say, aging in place is a popular term in current aging policy. It's defined as remaining living in the community with some level of independence rather than in residential care. This approach to aging in place is mostly about not going into higher levels of care. So it's very focused around the dependencies of later life. A somewhat different view is taken by a very large organization in the United States called AARP, which at least used to stand for the American Association of Retired Persons. It has several million members. And they say aging in place is the ability to live in one's own home and community safely, independently, comfortably, regardless of age, income, or ability. This approach is not focused on frailty or the need for care, and it very much has features of that idea of leaving no one behind. 2 very different views. In our own work, in our own research, me and colleagues, we've summed up the ways in which we think the term has been used in various ways. And we say the term aging in place has become a metaphor for the benefits that may accrue to people as they grow older in the same location. These include feelings of security and familiarity, sense of identity, and maintenance of caring relationships and roles. Aging in place offers people a sense of belonging in an unstable world. Now, that was all very poetic, but I think I'd actually write it differently now. I think because of all of the assumptions embedded in that statement, I must say that we experts are very good at prescriptions about other people. And now I'm one of those other people. I'm rather sensitive to the prescriptions not necessarily being a good fit with the situation. Now, we are going to start here first by some sympathy for the minister, because she's expected to do quite a lot about aging and a whole bunch of other things as well. As I was preparing this talk to you, I read the minister's mandate letter. Now, I don't know whether any of you have ever done this, but it's actually very interesting reading these mandate letters because they're really job descriptions. And the minister has a very big job, as you know. She's the Minister of Environment, the Minister of Health and Social Services, the minister responsible for the Yukon Housing Corporation. That's huge. Most other parts of the country, you have many people doing that job. So I think there's good news here for us, if not necessarily for the minister. There should be a lot less concern in Yukon about these things we called silos of responsibility. You know, we got health, and we got social, and we got transport, and there were no cross connections. Well, when you got it all within one portfolio, perhaps the silos get broken down. The minister could speak to that issue. And of course, the second thing is she's asked us all here to help figure it out. And so, you know, I think the turnout here, the minister's presence, is a great example of how there's a tremendous interest in this whole area of aging and aging in place. I have to say, though, I understand that the tea this afternoon is a bit of a draw as well. But what does the minister want input on? Well, here's what her mandate letter says about aging in place. Among her other responsibilities, one is to work, and I quote, to work with Yukoners to create solutions to promote aging in place and a full spectrum of care, both public and private, while keeping, and she mentioned, while keeping the Whistle Bend continuing care development at 150 beds. Now, that sounds a lot like the nursing home definition. However, here's the definition that was part of the information sent out to you and I expect drew you in. Aging in place means having the supports and services you need to live safely and independently in your home or community for as long as you wish and are able. We realize this can mean different things to different people, and there are unique circumstances in each community. This summit will help us identify innovative and practical ideas to work with Yukoners to promote aging in place. That sounds a lot more like that AARP definition. But here's the provocative question: is promotion premature? Perhaps first we need to think about what we want to promote, if anything, and toward what end. Now, as you know about me, a little bit about me from what Paula said in the introduction, I'm very fortunate that I get to be in many different places in the world. And all of them, I would say, have their advantages and disadvantages. So I want to just tell you a few stories. And my stories are about aging in different places. My stories have titles. They have titles like Black Mamba Snake, Coldest Place on Earth, Tiny Spaces in Crowded Places, Even the Tide No Longer Comes In, and What Happened to the Fish and Chip Shop. They illustrate, I think, the challenges in thinking about people and about places and about the connections between them. I rather like to tell stories and to hear stories from others. They say a lot about people's lives as they journey across that, what we hope is a very long life course. We in the North, as far as I know, invented good storytelling. Think about the sagas from Iceland. that have a lot of elements of dark places, which I guess isn't surprising when you live in the north and have a lot of time over the winter. Those sagas and stories I see in other parts of Scandinavia, I certainly see here, so I think I'm in good company. But in case you lose track of the point as I meander through a few of these stories, here it is. Places change. People change. And the challenge is to find the best fit between people and places as all of us change across the last part of our lives. We have now, when you think of age 60 or 65 as kind of your entry, and the minister is, coming up to that celebration before too long, and people living to be 100 or more, we're talking about 40 years. We don't ever lump together newborns up to age 40 and think about them as all the same, do we? So let's not lose track of that. Aging is what we're talking about, not the aged. Okay, so let's talk about a few places and stories of places that tell us about what it's like to live there and to grow old there. Now, I've got to start with here, or sort of here, because I must tell you that when I go to other parts of the world, and they know that I'm sort of from northern Canada, I mean, I'm just from Edmonton, but, everywhere else in the world, think of that as pretty remote and northern. We are so exotic. What do they think about us? Well, they've watched the program on TV that was made in Northwest Territories, Ice Road Truckers, they know that one. And they know that as soon as we step out our doors, there are polar bears and grizzlies and who knows what else that's out there that's going to eat us or at least our grandchildren. But they don't know a lot else. And there's some people out there who should know better. I was on the phone just last week with a very senior person from one of the World Health Organization regional offices. He lives in Washington, D.C., so we can forgive him perhaps about not knowing a great deal about Canada. Nonetheless, his remit, he's the director of aging for the Pan American Health Organization. Now, this guy's from Cuba, warm, kind of tropical place. He's living in Washington, D.C., which, as far as I'm concerned, is way more dangerous than a polar bear outside the back door. So I said, Pan-American. I said, does that include Canada? He said, well, of course it does. And I said, do you come to Canada often? He said, well, there's a little pause. Those pauses are interesting. He said, well, not too often. I said, well, when were you here last? It turned out it was several years ago. And he came to Canada in February, and he came to the coldest place on earth. You know where that was? Winnipeg. I mean, it was a little chilly, I'm sure. But as far as he just couldn't imagine people living in Winnipeg. I don't know that he has any concept that there might be a little further north than Winnipeg. But so we do. I mean, we do live in a harsh climatic environment. But most of the work on aging and on place is about harsh environments, but it's not about cold. It's about places in the world that are harsh because of extreme heat, because of lack of water. In the past year, I have worked with some people at one of the World Health Organization centers, this one in Japan, And they had a really quite wonderful project about supporting older people living in difficult environments in low-income countries. And one of the ones that struck me was a project that was being undertaken in northern India in a very large desert region where 50 million people live and where there's severe water deprivation, and the major input to help older people age better in their places was to try to increase what they called water security, to make sure people had adequate water. So it puts harsh climate into a new perspective. Similarly, in Australia, which has a lot of, I think, similarities to Canada, you have a lot of people clustered around the edges and remote areas that also are very harsh because of climate. So how do we deal with harsh climates here? Are there any similarities to other parts of the world? Places are also harsh because of danger. I've already told you about Washington, D.C., but I've got one more story, and that's my black mamba snake story that came to me not long ago from a friend of mine in South Africa. And he sent me a photograph of a snake that was more than 3 meters long. So if you can imagine, this guy was standing on the bed of his pickup truck. He had a long pole. He was holding up this snake as high as he could reach, and it barely touched the ground. Turned out that this is the fastest, deadliest snake in the world, at least according to my colleagues, and they found it under the barbecue. Think about having a nice occasion outside, grilling something with the grandchildren, and finding that under the barbecue. So places can be extraordinarily dangerous. What are the dangers in this place? And what are the dangers people see? Because sometimes people see dangers and worry in ways that we don't always know. Lots of harsh places, tsunamis. It turns out Nepal is the most prevalent, not tsunami, excuse me, the place is most likely to have earthquakes and is in one of the most seismically active regions of the world. In 2015, an earthquake in Nepal killed 8,000 people. An earthquake that was associated with it killed a whole bunch of people in the Himalayas as well. What about living in places that are dangerous and unstable like those? And then there are places with high or low population density. Those are places as well that have particular but different challenges. Thinking about housing, and we think a lot about that in Canada's north, my tiny spaces in crowded places comes from Hong Kong, which I think might be the most densely populated city in the world. It has almost 7,000 persons per square kilometer. They're building high-rise apartments in Hong Kong that have a maximum size of 128 square feet. So that's, 10 by 12, a little more than 10 feet by 12 feet? Think about the spaces in which we live and how those relate. There's not much space there for a multi-generation family. In contrast, just for your interest's sake, Whitehorse has 56 people per square kilometer, and Yukon overall has 0.1. It's not crowded. So so where do you want to live? And what are the advantages and disadvantages? I can imagine it's a lot easier to provide services to a very densely populated place than one in which we're so darn dispersed that traveling to that person can be tougher, can take much more time than providing the service when you get there. Places where people have grown old but never wanted to be. I must do an example here of one that to me has very powerful messages, and perhaps some messages that in interesting ways can resonate for us here. That's work that I've done in South Africa in one of the post-apartheid communities where Black South Africans live. This particular community was one in the early 1950s from which children and young people, mostly, were forcibly removed and relocated. These young, and the study was of people who 50 years later have grown old in this new place. They were moved there all at once. Many of these children came home from school. Their families were gone. The houses had been destroyed, and they were scooped. You heard about the 60s scoop? Think about the 50s scoop in South Africa. They were moved to a new place where they didn't know anyone, where other people often didn't speak the same tribal language as they did, where they didn't even always get moved with their brothers and sisters, because the apartheid rule was, if you look black, you go this place. If you look colored, not so black, you go that place. And some families were divided because of those color decisions. 50 years later, when the research was done, there was no one in that community who could name any place in the community that they thought was valuable or important. What they had were their relationships with other people who'd grown old there. What they didn't have were good relationships with their children or grandchildren who wanted to set that whole apartheid period behind them, who were getting more education, who were distancing themselves from the sense of loss that continued in the lives of their parents and grandparents. I think we have much to learn about that powerful story about relocation and about place and about aging in places. So let me finish with 2 or 3 examples about changing places, because I think we need to pay attention to those too. The first one is what happened to the fish and chip shop. And it comes from work being done in cities, in inner cities, central cities in the UK. The UK, over a period of at least 30 years, has had waves of immigrants from various parts of the world, from parts of Northern Africa, from India, from Eastern Europe. As those people have emigrated, they too have settled in cities. So you have a group of people now old, born in the UK, who've grown old in the same neighborhood where they always lived, and yet the place has changed dramatically around them. They're not hearing the same language, they're not seeing the same people, the shops and restaurants have changed. Aging in place, isn't that an interesting question when it's not very much the same place? A community in the Maritimes, the tide no longer comes in community, is one in which we did some work a few years ago, and it's a community in decline. The fisheries is not doing well. There was some farming there, but a lot of the younger people don't want to farm, and they left. And one person whom we talked to summed up her community, and she said, the train no longer comes in, the bus no longer comes in, and you know what the rest of it was. And pretty soon, the tide's no longer going to come in. So very much at a community in decline. A very rapidly aging community because young people were leaving. There were close to 40% of the population there over age 65. The community recognized that there was a lot of need, but this was a resource-poor community. An example of how do you get the fit between the people and the place. And finally, another one in Ontario, not too far from Toronto. And that community is one that had always been, it's up in what's called the Trent-Severn River system, marginal farmland, but people have been farming there for years. And many had retired and moved into town, and it was a pleasant place to live. There were services, there were shops, people knew one another. People are retiring from Toronto, 2 hours away. This little community is beautiful. It's on the river, and people want to live there. And over a period of less than 10 years, the average house price had quadrupled. They were building, what were the services they were building? Golf courses, golf clubs, curling clubs, all just great. But if you're living on a fixed income and your property taxes have also quadrupled, there were people finding that they could no longer live in the community where they lived a long time. So, this is where we get to this idea of the fit between the community and the older person. And just one final thing about older people. The very first course I took in gerontology when I was still in my 20s, I met this professor that I now know was very wise, and he said, there's really only one thing you need to know about aging. I thought, gosh, I'm here to do a whole degree. What am I going to do for 3 years? And he said, as people grow older, they get to be more so. More so. More like you were when you were younger. You know, you were the one who always saw the glass half empty. Well, now it's 3/4 empty. You were always the social butterfly. Sure enough, you continue to gather people around you. You were always a curmudgeon. 80 years later, you've really fine-tuned curmudgeon. So, what he said is, it's kind of boring to study babies and children. They're all sort of the same. But when you get to be 70 or 80 or 90, here we are. Huge challenge for policy people, because it's tough to do policy for all this variety. But here we are. And not only that, we're going along this 40-year span from the minister who's going to be our new member soon, the member of the club of growing older, to the people who are 100 plus. That's 40 years. How is that going to play out in terms of health, in terms of income, in terms of friends? Well, part of it has to do with the more so. Part of it has to do with our own personal history of how well we've done. Some of us are going to do just fine as we go along the track. Others of us are going to struggle. So we got to pay attention to that as well. So, and just two things as well, because I think they're the things that are often unsaid in these kinds of forums. One is, who's not here today? Who didn't come because they couldn't get here, because they didn't feel welcome, because they're isolated? Who's not here? So we do talk about consulting, and we do our darndest, but we can't always really include. And the second one, which is part, I think, of my own concern and worry as someone who studies families and aging, and that is, please let us set aside any romantic notions we have about generations in families always being warm and caring and loving to be one another. I got to tell you, I've got one grandchild, And I really don't think I'd want him to be my carer ever. I've got a couple others, two to be good. And that caring goes both ways, but some families should not be forced together to try to care for each other. So that's a personal bias, and I'm going to let it go. Well, I won't let it go, but I'll let it go for this podium. Okay, so here's my final statement, and then perhaps we have a minute or two for questions. I'd suggest that a good goal for those of us on the aging journey, and we all are on that journey, and for those who wish to help make the journey as positive as possible, that we consider this idea, and I've borrowed heavily from the World Health Organization's report on global aging. In it, they say, healthy aging is being able to be and to do what you value. That requires some creativity on the part of those of us who are aging, and on the part of all of us, I think, to find that best fit between we diverse older people and the changing settings in which we live our lives. Thank you all, ladies and gentlemen.